So next we've got Philip Goad joining us from University of Melbourne, and Philip's the Chair of Architecture and Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor.
Yeah, it sounds very grand.
It is very grand, and teaches in architectural history and design, and he's going to be talking about the critic and the car, Robin Boyd, automobiles and Australian architecture.
Thanks very much, Mark. Between 1947 and his death in 1971, Melbourne architect Robin Boyd was Australia's most public commentator on architectural matters. Two of his books, Australia's Home and The Australian Ugliness, became bestsellers and are still in print today. Boyd was also a gifted architect, designing dozens of houses as well as a series of institutional buildings and a handful of commercial commissions. He also loved cars. His biographer, Geoffrey Searle, remarked that since the Italian Futurist Manifesto of 1909 declared the racing car more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace, modern architects delighting in industrial cleverness were besotted with stylish automobiles. Robin Boyd was no exception. And here he is with his daughter, the late Susie Boyd, in the Australian Alps. So designer cars were a minor passion for Boyd. But there were some cars that he didn't like, and Boyd actively expressed that disdain in his writing. What has not been observed in the wealth of scholarship on Robin Boyd is the importance of the car as a pivotal reference point for his views on Australian taste and on the Australian built environment. Car design for Boyd became a powerful metaphor through which to reflect upon and critique Australian design in its buildings and urban environment. So what I'm going to do today is outline for the first time, I think, the ambivalent relationship between one of Australia's most important tastemakers amidst the rise of post-war automobile culture. The paper, I hope, shows that even while Boyd expressed disdain for what he perceived as popular culture's uncritical embrace of automobile culture, his personal fascination with cars and his public critique were in fact productive for the ongoing development of Australian architecture. In 1946, when Robin Boyd completed his first commissioned residence, a modern flat-roofed house for Howard Pettigrew in Kew, that's on the top left of the image, the accommodation of a motor car was an intrinsic element of the L-shaped composition. Inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's 1930s Usonian houses, and that's the coloured image, two coloured images below, where Wright argued that the garage should be eliminated and that the emphatic horizontal roof of the carport was a key aspect of the house's pinwheeling plan. It was clear that Boyd was, like so many architects of his generation, ready in the immediate post-war years to recast the public face of the modern house as a receptacle and showcase for the sleek lines of the motor car. The roof of the house also became the roof of the motor car. Occupant and automobile were granted equal status. That same year, when Boyd's own house was completed in Riversdale Road in Camberwell, what was presented to the street was an extension of the house's low-pitched gable roof. Half of the gable was devoted to a pergola, the other half to a carport housing the Boyd's Standard 8. The conventional garage had been brought to the front of the house, replaced and made an architectural virtue. It was also a demonstration of convenience. Ownership of the car was proudly displayed. In Boyd's subsequent houses through the 50s and 1960s, this strategy of doing away with the conventional freestanding garage down the side and in the backyard was almost always followed. While many cars were accommodated beneath the house due to its aerial form or a sloping site, most of Boyd's roofs for his houses, whether grand or small, were frequently consciously designed to cover all and include the car as a natural, expected and integral part of the house's design. And this is Ken Meyer of the Meyer department store, Ken and Prue Meyer's house, Pelican down at Mount Eliza. This combined image of house and car echoed the trope of the early 20th century's modernist obsession with cars and architecture, most famously exemplified by the image of Le Corbusier's Voisin on the left, contrasted with the cubist lines of his Villa Stein at Garches of 1929. The placement of the car against the architecture was deliberate, the analogy quite straightforward. Both car and house were projected to present similar ideals of combined progressive aesthetics and mechanical perfection. The house was a machine for living in, the car was a machine for modern movement. It was a theme that fascinated architects for decades, even the reason for English New Brutalist architects Allison and Peter Smithson, in a moment of deliberate critical echo, look at this image, look at this one, to have Peter Smithson's 1962 photograph of their weekend house at Upper Lawn in Wiltshire given special historical parallel with Le Corbusier, with their Citroen DS Goddess parked out the front. But this time, the aesthetic connection between house and car was far less clear. The Smithsons deliberately made the point of contrast. The French car as sophisticated, artful machine and designer object. The house as a melange, a mixture of existing as-found stone wall, old and new openings with new building form grafted onto it. They were making a deliberate point that there was no direct relationship between house and car. Mark Strizich's 1960 photograph of Robin Boyd's second house in Walsh Street in South Yarra has the same message. There you can see Boyd's Citroen Goddess nosing its way into the left-hand side of the photograph. House and car read as comfortable opposites rather than a mutual reinforcement. A theme repeated perhaps ironically in Boyd's house-like gable-roof carports for his display homes for the Apple Tree Hill estate at Waverley of 1965. Now, in writing about Australian architecture, Boyd occasionally reflected on the influence of the car on the shape of the Australian suburb. In 1952, he acknowledged the appearance of the garage in Australia as early as 1915, saying, this is Robin Boyd, inside, high and excitable, lived the new car. Last year it had been housed in the stable or been given a makeshift shelter of weatherboards or iron. From now on, its port would become increasingly important as a feature of the house. Now, Boyd didn't illustrate what he meant here, but examples in 1930s Melbourne abounded, where period revival houses, be they Georgian revival or Boyd's reviled Spanish mission, grand or humble, would invariably house cars antipathetic to the house's stylistic origins. You can see the garage on the left, sort of El Pueblo style. Significantly, Boyd acknowledged the spatial influence that owning a car would have on everyday Australian suburbia. And I'm quoting Boyd again. The car had the effect of spacing houses a little further apart. Before 1910, suburban builders customarily made as much as possible of the width of the lot by taking the house to within 5 or 6 feet of either side fence. Now, everyone, with or without a car, began to insist on room for a drive past one side of the building. If these comments in Australia's Home were astute observations of the effect of the car on an Australian suburb, Boyd's views on cars themselves were sharpened by his first visit to the US in 1956, a year-long stint at MIT as a visiting professor. With light teaching duties, Boyd made most of his time looking at buildings, meeting architects and reflecting on what he saw. As he and his wife Patricia drove south from Boston in early 1957, they saw motels, motels, motels. Boyd looked at parking lots, multi-storey and pigeonhole parking structures, more hotels and motels, shopping centres and donut bars, and all this observation was largely done through driving. Cars were a Boyd preoccupation in his first 6 months. In Los Angeles, Boyd enjoyed driving a 56 Ford with power-assisted cigar lighter. In Boston, he was to remark, and this is Robin Boyd, every architect drives a Studebaker. It and the Thunderbird, and a few imported, are the only good-looking cars on the road. But, vile as it looks, I love and drive the automatic Ford, 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 10 seconds. In October 1956, Boyd made drawings in one of his letters home of the wings of the new DeSoto from Chrysler, the car which would be lampooned in drawn form a year later in 1958 by the British writer Osbert Lancaster in his rendition of the Coca colonial style in his book In Here of All Places. It would be Lancaster's drawing style that Boyd would emulate in his drawings of Holdens in the Australian Ugliness of 1960. Boyd's intuitions about America were seen, read and then drawn largely through British eyes. That's the 56 DeSoto on the left. In May 1957, just 2 months before Boyd departed from the US, the Architectural Review, that's the British architectural journal, published the special issue Machine Made America. In that issue, John McHale's marginalia to the same issue on the right featured a smorgasbord of American design and consumer culture, including images of the Eames House, Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome in Honolulu, the Hammerley rifle, the rear end of the Flight Suite year Chrysler at 57, and significantly the dramatic tail fin of the 57 DeSoto, which Boyd had described and drawn in his letters. For Boyd, America was, as for British commentators Raina Bannon and Ian McCullough, an intriguing mix of technological and artistic sophistication, and pop culture as well, that verged on the kitsch and the grotesque. For an outsider, the phenomenon of America offered untold opportunities for self-reflection as a thinker and designer, and in the form of a bitingly critical appraisal by comparison on the state of Australia. Cars were frequently the means by which Boyd framed his criticism. As he and his wife Patricia travelled, they experienced the country's wealth, its commercial glamour, and its shabby squalor in equal amount. Nothing was exempt from Boyd's magpie eye. Ordinary things became extraordinary, or useful reminders that Australia was faring better or worse. He took it all in, and much would return in public lectures, newspaper and journal articles over the next 5 years as biting satire, following themes like, quote, the term Australia's Cadillac cult, and its pursuit of what he called a Statler Hill culture. Cars and hotels were the benchmarks of Boyd's critique. Now, his reflections on these American experiences found collective form in his 1960 book, The Australian Ugliness. There again, cars, and especially Australian car design, form the fundamental analogy for critiquing Australian visual culture. In 1960, Boyd's prime target was the recently released Australian-designed, two-toned and winged Holdens Special. Boyd used not only the car, but also its name Special, to make his argument for the Australian habit of aping American design. So he starts to use this word special. It's quite clear what he's getting. In Boyd's frontispiece to part one, a hapless couple stand in front of a two-tone Holdens Special, which sits in front of a faux period-style home and two high-rise buildings, one of which has a billboard on its roof announcing Special. The next full-page drawing by Boyd includes an aerial view of a vast factory, probably GMH, with its office building having extra written on its roof and the home of Special emblazoned above its front doors that themselves are flanked by two-tone glazed spandrel panels. The next has an urban street scene with every sign, be it illuminated or on the sides of buildings, displaying the word Special. While the best known of these satirical images is Boyd's hapless couple, they've parked their Holdens Special and they're depicted arriving at a two-tone skillion roof, tail fin-like, Special motel. The Holdens Special had become Australian architecture. Boyd even wrote directly about the Holden in this book. And I'm quoting Boyd now, so this is a qualification. You don't need to stone me, I'm just reporting from the front. This is what Robin Boyd says. Perhaps the Holden, General Motors Australian car, advertised as Australia's own car, is the best example of Australia's happy acceptance of second-hand Americana. With sales higher than all other makes put together, its body styling keeps straight on the track of its richer American cousins at a measured distance of 2 models behind, while it indulges the ravenous appetite for multicoloured effects and disdains labour-saving mechanical innovations such as power braking or steering. In Boyd's introduction to the 1968 reprinting of his phenomenally successful diatribe, he admitted that he owed the Holden a conciliatory word, and this is Boyd speaking now, since the 1967 model is so immeasurably improved from the awkward thing that was the current model in 1960. But Boyd wasn't prepared to completely concede. His book's subsequent covers had emphasised the roadside view. David Wyer's 1971 cover on the left was a collage of cars right side up and upside down amid a riot of signage while the cover of the 72 Pelican edition had a sign announcing cars above a pair of cracked spectacles, making analogy with a cracked windscreen. The 1960s paperback versions of the Australian Ugliness included black and white photographs by Nigel Buesst, with captions like "A humble of Holdens in native habitat," "Two moods of America's austerica, proud and presumptuous," and another entitled "The Feature Market, a Coles New World supermarket car park with advertising bunting proclaiming bargains a sellout." His 1967 comments didn't stop there. Boyd went on. "Yet that thing," and he's referring back to the 1960 Holdens special, "was such an unspeakably crude example of cynical commercial design that I think there's historical justification for not revising the rather harsh opinions of it written at the time. Even now, it's not necessary to alter the observation that General Motors, in conformity with the best practices of austericanism, always cunningly continues to keep their colonial model 2 years behind Detroit's fashion lead. No blame attaches to General Motors for this. They're not in the business to elevate Australian taste or her cultural independence. No one in his right mind could expect a popular Australian car at the point of sale to be anything but a pale copy of Detroit style, unadventurous and unoriginal, even when of better design." And you note the qualification there. Boyd's criticism of Australian car design is withering and probably overblown. But this is deliberate, challenging local design culture to not meekly or badly follow international trends. As an architect embedded within a professional setting, such direct criticism of his own fellow practitioners, architects, would have been seen as untoward. But of the design of an everyday item such as the car, Boyd could freely use this metaphor to full effect, and he goes on. Again, this is Boyd. "On the other hand, there's every reason to expect that soon after the new Holden reaches the street, it will be adorned with a remarkable collection of entirely Australian accessories, including plastic draft reflectors, bobbles or a fringe around the rear window, football striped cushions on the back shelf, red reflecting sticky tape on a bumper bar, and a variety of comical yellow transfers on the windows." Boyd is, none too subtly, indicating the Australian habit to over-decorate to what he called cloak and camouflage in Australia's built environment and interior design. The car had provided for Boyd the most compelling metaphor for how Australians treat their urban environment. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to just show you that Boyd not only was a critic, but he designed buildings that directly addressed the Australian roadside. And he believed that what he was proposing were better alternatives to roadside architecture. And these included the Black Dolphin Motor Inn at Merimbula. You can see Mark Strizage's very beautiful photographs, which involve the car as well. And so this placement of better Australian interior and exterior design against the Holden motor car. Other Australian architects were making similar new aesthetic contributions to the nation's roadside architecture. And we mustn't forget this. There's Enrico Taglietti's Noah's Restaurant for the Townhouse Motel in Canberra, and there's Bruce Rickard's Cobb & Co drive-in restaurant in Tempe in New South Wales. And there are others. There are drive-in cinemas, drive-in banks, as one reviewer pointed out very, very wisely to me as well. What set Boyd apart from these examples, however, was that he had writing and his long engagement with the issue of cars and architecture. And just a few others of these buildings. There's the John Batman Motor Inn. There's the President Motor Inn as well. And perhaps the most celebrated of his piece of roadside architecture, his answers to USA's so-called Googie architecture, was Robin Boyd's Fishbowl Takeaway Food Restaurant in Toorak Road, South Yarra of 1970. With its bright blue Fuller-inspired geometric sphere with no other function other than to sign this early fast food outlet. Planned to be one of a series of such buildings spread across the suburbs, bringing new meaning to takeaway fish and chips in Melbourne. And he also did a design for a new Golden Fleece series of service stations. Boyd also included the car as a key determining element in one of his few polemical visions for a city of the future. In 1956, he prepared drawings for Melbourne 2000 at the behest of the Royal Automobile Club of Victoria, the RACV, as part of their response to the 1964 City of Melbourne planning scheme. Boyd's proposal involved fixing levels to a common reference point for each major city block, so that all new buildings would be on the same basis with respect to the provision of lower floor levels, thus enabling car parks to cover several levels of entire city blocks. Here was one of Boyd's most polemical statements of urban reform, a blend of Bill Geddes' Tomorrowland and Japanese metabolism, yet oddly retaining the city's cathedrals. So, to conclude, throughout his career, which ended abruptly in 1971 at the age of 52, Boyd also took an interest in the look of the cars that he actually owned. He never bought a Holden, but he did own a series of cars which, like his writing, go a long way to describe the unusual and special relationship that he, Australia's spokesman for matters architectural, would have with cars and the built environment. The proud owner, post-war, of a Standard 8, Boyd would also own two Citroen DS Goddesses, one powder blue, the other silver. So here's Robin's Citroen on his side of the carport at the back of Walsh Street, and Patricia's, her little Fiat, on the other side. He also, and the Citroen, of course, being the classic architect's car. He owned two Studebaker Hawks without fins, and then finally, and most surprisingly to many people, a Dodge Phoenix. And this isn't his, I don't have a photograph of his, but this is a Dodge Phoenix, which, to Boyd's chagrin, given that he bought it to cheer himself up, had reliable, unreliable air conditioning. Of the Dodge, Robin Boyd was to say, it was, and I quote, "just a great lump of an American car, but I love it for the ease of handling and comfort." Now, all were designer objects. While his writings display ambivalence to the local product, it's ironic that in all other respects he would champion patronage of Australian design, but not Australian cars, and not even to the point of ownership. Perhaps what frustrated Boyd most was every other Australian's pride in car ownership. For him, that pride didn't seem to extend to Australian pride in visual culture and the environment. In John Button's edited volume Look Here, Considering the Australian Environment, published in 1968 and accompanied by numerous Kirkville photographs that focused on cars and a car-ridden and car-affected urban environment, Robin Boyd, in his contribution to this book, was to bemoan, often we Australians do have this pride in our cars, but we don't have it in our cities. How can we transfer a little of this pride from our cars to the public environment? The trouble is that in this fascinating transitional period of Australian development, no one has an uncomplicated love for this country. Boyd had, in his words, and I quote, "a burning sort of love impatience for Australian design. Cars, as things often held most dearly by everyday Australians like their houses, were again the target. For him, there was, amongst others, a possible solution. We can realise that made in Australia, this is Boyd speaking, important as it may be, is not necessarily the most patriotic claim a product can make. Designed and made in Australia would be more to the point. When Australians start to appreciate and develop the creative side of Australian design, the worst of the ugliness, the negative, the destructive, the uncivilised, the uncouth side of it will begin to fade away." Nearly 50 years on, Robin Boyd, just as the man who might be the man in the suit here, might be scratching his head. The quality of our Australian urban environment has arguably improved beyond his comprehension. And Australian car design is in fact informing the rest of the world. The trouble is that we're just not making the cars here anymore. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip. That was excellent. Very entertaining and thought-provoking. Yeah, it sort of gives us a really good appreciation of Boyd's dry sense of humour, but I do wonder how he would respond if those sorts of criticisms were levelled at his work.
Yeah, I think he probably would have been quite used to it, would have risen to it. I think what is remarkable is he's a man of many contradictions, and if you had to say to him, what sort of furniture would you buy, he would recommend Australian designers all the time. But not to resist buying an Australian car, I think was a really significant contradiction.
Very significant, yeah. Do we have any questions?
I've offended everyone.
All car designers in here. Yeah.
Question about the '56 Olympics. Do I remember Boyd arguing for the clarity of street architecture or street lights, removal of verandas?
That was a city father's gesture. So for the 1956 Olympics, they removed many of the 19th century cast iron verandas to modernise the cityscape. Parking meters were introduced too around that time, and they got rid of a whole lot of the old tram stops. There was a new design brought in as well. Boyd himself was driving around America during the Olympics, so he wasn't actually here.
So that was a city father's...
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Dad. I think you've opened up another whole area for someone to go home for homework, and that's just motor garages beside a house, behind a house,
Yeah.
or whatever. It's something I hadn't ever thought of, but yeah, it's a little interesting area to maybe follow up by someone.
Sure.
Just a comment, if I may. If I would have had the chance, I would have loved to ask Robin Boyd, which came first, styling or function, in the design of any of his buildings? What do you think?
Yeah. He would have argued function, and he would have argued commodity and firmness, and he would have said if you got those things correct, then delight would follow. And it goes back, I think, to Penny's argument about the Bauhaus, that if you got those things right, beauty would actually be inherent in the object.
I've asked that question to many, many architects, and it's always the same answer.
Right.
And I don't believe a damn word of it. Not a damn word.
Well,
A good case in point is the new hospital here in town. Now, which came first, the function on that, or the swoopy lines that the computer allowed the architects to design?
Yeah, look, you make a really terrific point. That's the Peter McCallum, the new Peter McCallum, the new Comprehensive Cancer Centre. That's in fact the product of two designers. You have an exterior stylist, and you're absolutely right. It's a very young firm. And then you have hospital specialists who are basically the engineers of health. And those two work together. And the interior styling of the great volume inside is done by those young architects who did the exterior. They almost like do the sort of interior fit out. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. But I would say if you had to quiz Boyd more closely, if you go to his house, that's a marvellously perverse, I think, building where the whole roof is a draped series of cables, like a sort of echo of Sydney, the Sydney Myer Music Bowl. In some respects, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's all about a big gesture. So I think he's not immune from the gesture.
Have we got another question?
I was just going to make an interesting observation on your comment about how housing architects had to change for garages. My house was built in 1907 and it was pretty much an old-fashioned late Victorian style house, but it was one of the first houses built in our street, and as was the case that you were explaining, it virtually covered the whole width of the original block. Fortunately, when they acquired their first motor car in the 1920s, most of the rest of the street hadn't been built on, so they purchased 2 feet. And I know this because I did the title work when we took our house from the next door neighbour's block, which hadn't been built on. So our block is now curiously wider than every other block in our street, and we have a 1920s fibro cement garage, sadly not in original condition, but still in the original style in the backyard, which I'm currently thinking I need to reappreciate its heritage significance. Has any work been done on the study of suburban garages and things like that in those early years?
No, not really. And look, I think that the comment about garages and carports being an area of study is really interesting, because in the idea of Melbourne consolidating, we have not rejected the idea of housing the car. So instead of the driveway going down the side of the house, we've now moved it across to come in front of the house, and we've doubled the number of cars. So the car has changed effectively suburban streetscapes dramatically, and with the sense that people should be driving less, the streetscape will change again. But many of those 1950s streetscapes with the car in front are actually counter to many urban planning controls about what is a supposedly good heritage streetscape. And cars don't enter into urban planning's idea of heritage streetscapes. So, I mean, there hasn't been anything done, but there should be. There are even Nitlock, Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Money designed garages in Nitlock, a special concrete block, which really are heritage objects as well.
Just something about garages. A student of mine discovered a Waterhouse, who's a Sydney architect. He designed a garage as part of the house in 1908. So that's fairly early. 1907 or 1908. So that's a very early example, and obviously a very wealthy family who owned a lot of the Craig House. I'm just forgetting everything. I just wanted to say, probably because I'm an architectural historian, that I just thought it was a fabulous talk, and that incredibly, which you do so well, careful unpicking of Boyd's reading of the special. Genius, and I just want to thank you for it. I thought I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Well, look, I have to say, if I hadn't been asked to give a paper at an automotive historians conference, I probably wouldn't have made the connection, which is fascinating. So I have to thank Harriet for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, it does.
We've got time for one more.
Yeah.
I've just got a comment about garages again. I love it too. But I did an assessment of a suburban city called Monterey, which is down on Botany Bay, and which they were a host of 1927, 28, 29 fibro garages, prefabricated, illustrated in the James Hardy fibro books, in which they were put up, but the lots were not wide enough for a motor car to go down the side. So you ought to find the garage in the back of the house in Monterey, but it's impossible for a contemporary motor car to get in it. And not only that, but the front door of the house is actually on the side, so it was often a step added, so that added a bit more danger to driving out. That's 1920.
Very interesting. Can you all join me in thanking Philip once again?